Hi there, welcome. I'm Bob Thompson, and I'd like to welcome you to our Philanthropic Planner program. For those who have looked at us before, we talk about that exciting, just the greatest subject in the world, philanthropy. Now, for you other 99.999%, it's probably very boring, but we continue to do this. And people ask me, hey, Bob, what is this? The reason is we want to talk about a subject that really isn't a part of our everyday dialogue. We don't converse with each other normally about philanthropy and the different aspects of it. But the reason that we produce this program is to share with you what we think is the importance of philanthropy to the local community, to the state, to the country and the globe, and how we kind of take for granted the various aspects of philanthropy, from the nonprofit sector that depends so much on your generosity. We need to share and have a friendly forum to discuss ideas and strategies and what your and my neighbor is doing that maybe I can do the same thing, or it resonates. We have a lot of problems out there, and when people think and they get their juices going and innovatively get that energy, we can solve a lot of the problems. And unlike the government, and I don't want to get into that subject, philanthropy can do so much more and more efficiently with the same dollars, but we just need to know and understand and periodically visit like the Philanthropic program. Philanthropic Planner, it's for you and me as philanthropists in whatever form, and also for professionals, philanthropic planners that are in their industry or business or practice are touched with philanthropy, because you and I would go to a wills, trusts, and estates attorney to update our will and talk about personal bequests, legacy bequests to family and friends and so on, but also talk about charitable bequests in our will or in our revocable trust, the different aspects of legal docs and wordsmithing for your interest. But also insurance professionals and trust officers and investment advisors and so on. So we have a lot of different, unfortunately, a lot of silos, but we need to connect and have meaningful dialogue and conversation. So welcome. We want to talk about these issues. We want to simplify the complexity that's perceived in this philanthropic world. We want to, and let me refer to the current Chronicle of Philanthropy. The cover page is "Why Don't Americans Give More?" And just start off and spend a few minutes about this particular issue. In 2012, the world of philanthropy and donations and gifts and that type of thing totaled about $313 billion. Now, that's a significant figure, but let's carve it down and let's talk about the meaning of that. In 2007, the total that we hear was total giving was $343 billion. So from 343 down to 313, 6 years later. And we see in publications such as this and Giving USA and the School of Philanthropy in Indiana, the projections are, if we continue the pace that we are, a 1-point-something% increase year over year, 2012 over 11. If we continue on at that pace, it's going to take us 6 more years to 2018 or 2019 to get back to where that high point was of 2007. Now, our needs are greater. The community out there is demanding more services. The nonprofits are under crunch. Things are improving the last 2 or 3 years, but this particular article is questioning not only why don't we give more, but presenting different solutions, different opinions from different people, academics to philanthropists from the foundations and so on. Now, 2012, of that $313 billion, 80%, and this is very typical year after year after year, 80% of that figure comes from individuals. Roughly 8% of the total comes from bequests. Now, last year over the year before, bequests were down, and we can look at possible reasons for concerns, recovering from recession, recovering from market crash. 2008, 2009, people are still concerned about healthcare costs today and future healthcare costs, inflation, rising tuition costs for colleges. So parents and grandparents are looking at that. So the distraction, the diversion, this pull away from charitable contributions to our favorite charities is kind of pressured down. We understand that. We have suggestions that certainly corporations, of that total, and this doesn't vary very much year to year, 5 to 6% of that $313 billion came from corporations. Almost 15% came from foundations. So when we total the individual at 80%, foundations at 14 or 15%, corporations at 5 to 6%. That is a typical mix of annual giving. Now, if we look back in history and give 5, we go back to Minnesota and Wisconsin and efforts. There's a suggestion that perhaps that we have a greater push by corporations to give more by individuals. If each and every one of us gave a small percentage, less than 1% more, and of the 161 million households, now of that group, there's certainly a percentage that cannot give. They don't have the discretionary monies. They don't have the capacity to give. But interestingly enough, even that lower income, percentage-wise, is giving much more than the middle class and the very wealthy. Very interesting phenomenon. But when we look at the dynamics of giving, there is we talk about philanthropy and neighbors helping neighbors. That really is a part of our DNA fabric of being Americans. It has been with us since the inception of our country. One of the reasons of seeking freedom and having the ability to take advantage of opportunities to grow, but to have the freedom, and from that, helping neighbors is a basic part of that value structure. So when we talk about why don't Americans give more, I'm not going to talk about that aspect of philanthropy. What I'd like to talk about today is a different part of philanthropy. And we've touched on it a number of times, probably touch on it every program very briefly, that there are a lot of ways for us to be philanthropists. You don't have to have a big 7-figure net worth. You don't have to be ultra wealthy. all of us can be philanthropists in one way or another. When we look at volunteering, that's a basic part of our effort to give our time, our skills, our money, and our hours, our time, volunteering in helping and to solve basic community problems and so on. We talk about de Tocqueville and his observations early in the birth of our country, and his observations of Americans will recognize a problem and solve it together with association of time, effort, and money. And back in those days, his observation thought that was a very unique aspect of this country. So today, and you know that I struggle with title of programs. I did hear from our last program, some good and some bad, some tongue-in-cheek and some giving me the raspberries about the light came on and the creative editing here was that I had this flashlight light bulb coming out of my mouth and my head and so on. So on the tongue-in-cheek side, I have a couple of my friends say, Bob, you're always in the dark, you needed that flashlight. And some others saying, were you born with this light because you're always in the dark? So other than that, my true friends, we have fun with it. But today, title-wise, Kathy and Floyd. Who? Do you know who Kathy and Floyd are by chance? And the subtitle is, how would we know? How would we know who Kathy and Floyd are? What's significance of Kathy and Floyd? Well, how would we know? I didn't see it in the paper. I didn't recognize it on any of the TV networks, cable or what have you. Kathy and Floyd. Kathy Hamilton and Floyd Hammer last week were honored by President Obama, and his guest, President Obama's guest, was George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, and recognizing Kathy and Floyd as the award-winning 5,000th Daily Point of Light recipient. And George Bush 41, at his inauguration in 1989 and announced in 1990, talked about the points of light and the significance and the meaning that he thought conceptually of the importance to our country. Now, we're familiar, I'm sure, with JFK's program Peace Corps. And shortly after, and in Peace Corps, we had volunteers go all over the world serving and helping and assisting people in other nations with clean water, helping them with food and medicine and so on. So JFK's impact with Peace Corps was very, very important. Shortly after that, a year and a half later, I believe it was, that VISTA came into being. And VISTA was a domesticated Peace Corps where VISTA volunteers would go in local communities in the U.S. and provide very valuable skill set and service to the local community. So we're familiar with those. Some of us may be familiar with AmeriCare. We had President Clinton kind of embellish some of these programs. But again, all based on volunteering and looking at the bigger picture of needs and problems and so on. And what is a very, very good way of addressing these problems. So the significance of Kathy and Floyd at this program just a few days ago before this taping was that Kathy and Floyd, about 10 or 11 years ago, a number of years after they retired, went to Tanzania as a part of one of these programs. I believe it was AmeriCare, but went to Tanzania and were shocked by the hunger, the problems of clean water, education, and so on. And they came back home and they wanted to do something. But remember, now this is a couple that worked all of their productive lives and retired, and we're going to enjoy retirement in the sense of relaxing and retiring and enjoying life. Came back and they founded Outreach, Inc. in a small town in, I believe, Union, Iowa. And from their founding there, they put together food packages. And in a very short period of time, they involved not just the people in the local community, the small community, but over the last 9-10 years, volunteers from not just all over Iowa, but this is spread to where millions on Labor Day, millions of packages, food packages, are put together and shipped to Tanzania, but to 15 other countries, and including the U.S. And over this period of time, a short period of time of 9 or 10 years, this group effort, founded by Kathy and Floyd, have put together 223 million meals, these food packages, 223 million meals, and recognized by President Obama and President Bush at this award, and representing 5,000th daily points of light. Now, let's look back a little bit at George Bush's inauguration in January of 90. As a personal point, forgive me with a personal comment, my second oldest daughter, Tracy, one of 3 of our children that toured with Up With People, her cast was at George Bush, his inauguration. And as they sat on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, President Bush talked about the importance of serving others and his concept, his thoughts on points of light. And Tracy came home and obviously was excited about being at the inauguration, her cast. And we have film and pictures of this, and I'm thinking that over the last 24 years, every day, there's a point of light recipient, award winner, so to speak, and that is 5,000 days of recognizing people that are giving back in some way, innovatively, using their energies, time, effort, and money, but in the form of volunteering, and I think that's pretty exciting. So at this function that at the White House a few days ago, we had President Obama recognizing President Bush, and Neil Bush, George and Barbara's son, who's the chair of Points of Light, talked about the history and the formation and the significance and what's happened over the years, and then introduced Michelle Nunn, who is the CEO of Points of Light. And I think my thoughts about this was Kathy and Floyd Who. How would we know How would we know? Well, if you're not tuned in to philanthropy in general, I guess, but how would you know about just another day, a point of light? When I read the local paper and I read other papers daily, I don't see anything other than 2 pages of crime in the Hartford Courant. I read about political chaos and partisanship and what the government's doing and not doing. I read about sports stars gone rogue and killing people and doing crazy things. I read about entertainers that, again, as talented as they may be, kind of bizarre, making millions and millions of dollars, but doing crazy things. I read of a royal baby being born and the time, the hours, the days leading up to and including the birth. These are all important things. Sports, entertainers, current events and that type of thing. I don't see anything about the important thing of philanthropy and any of this points of life daily stuff. I really think at some point in time we might consider asking or demanding or what have you that every publication have not a whole page, but just have a little section that's devoted daily, weekly, monthly, or whatever to meaningful contributions by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And when we look at Kathy and Floyd generating 223 million meals only because they went on a quasi-vacation and a mission and came back and were so energized to do something good. Now, when we look at problems in our own community and the country and globally, we look at the needs of poverty generates. We look in developing countries or emerging countries, poor countries. We look at needs of water, food, medicine. We talk about education, but how can you educate before safe water, food, and medicine? How can you learn without those 3 essential things? So when we look at solving problems, President Obama announced at this function that the National Community Service Corporation, and also announced that there would be an interagency that would try to bridge some of these, the gaps between some of these silos. All significant things. And I have to say that I was impressed with President Obama, not just in recognizing what has happened from the points of life idea, but we just don't hear about these things. Earlier last month, there was a conference on volunteering in Washington, D.C., and 5,000 people representing 48, 49 states and various countries, representing hundreds and hundreds of corporations coming together and through a giant think tank type of environment, recognizing, identifying some of these needs and what can this group collectively and individually and corporation. And one of the impressive things at this conference in DC was America First, and I believe J.P. Morgan Chase and their booth and their effort. And when we talk about efforts by corporations, 500 corporations made pledges at this conference in DC to, and they labeled it billion plus change. Billion plus change. Well, the significance of that is billions of dollars plus making change with this money. But 500 corporations making pledges to address this problem and to encourage and promote and to promote the corporation and employees to volunteer, to give of their time, and the corporation recognizing these employees with their volunteering in their community. I think that's impressive that we, at that conference, we talk about rivalries, we talk about non-political, apolitical, get away from partisanship, and you had Karl Rove and Donna Brazil dancing together. Now, these are not two politically in-line people, but the significance, the symbolism of them dancing at this conference to bring the rivalry, to get away from that partisanship in that political sense. But I think that when we talk about Kathy and Floyd and who are they, we need to know from our media, not just who Kathy and Floyd are, but the significance of what some of these contributions by these people, we talk about from Bush and Points of Life and when that was started, it's estimated that there are 25 million more volunteers today than what there was in 24 years ago. I think that's pretty significant. If I were to, and again a little personal, if I were to nominate some Points of Life and personally be selfish enough to recognize today, I have a grandson in Peru who is helping a small community in Peru with housing. His brother happens to be in West Virginia this week, helping on a housing habitat type of thing, a mission of the church. I would also have to mention my mother, 92, almost 93 years old, on a weekly basis, volunteering 2 or 3 days a week at a food bank, and providing meals and food for 150, 200 families every week. That would be my nomination or nominations for Points of Light in the future. And forgive the personal comment again. But we can do more, and Americans can do more. We can give just a little bit more, even if it represented a cup of coffee at Starbucks. Just everybody doing that would bring that 2% of giving up to 2.1 or 2.2, and it won't take us 6 years to get back to that peak of 2007. Write out that check, by the way, to Simsbury Community TV. They would be pleased to see that, and you would be giving back to your community in another small way. See you next time. Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.